Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Part 3, I'd recommend watching parts 1 and 2, but that is up to you. Copy someone's notes. Original link to the video, top of the description. Right below that, link to the Discord. We'd love to have you. Just click on it, send it right over there. Phones away. I will confiscate. Let's do it. All right. Empress Catherine at last. Let's go. My name's Connor, by the way. Hi. Did I say that?
For months, Catherine, together with one of her lovers, had been working with men high in government and the military to replace what they all saw as a disastrous and incompetent emperor, Peter. They'd been slowly putting out bribes and winning the hearts of the local guard regiments in St. Petersburg. But on the night of June 27th, it all came to a head due to a slip of the tongue. June 27th, 1762. A soldier in one of the guard regiments in St. Petersburg gets spooked. He turns to one of his officers and asks if it's true that the conspiracy against the emperor has been found out. Turns out the officer he just asked is one of the few who was not in on the plot. The soldier is arrested on the spot, as is one of the guard.
You got spooked thinking someone might know about it, and you tell someone about it.
The few who is central to the rebellion. The time is now or never. The revolt must begin. The principal conspirators gather, panicked. A man named Panin, a man who would go on to be one of Catherine's highest officials, stays them, saying their freedom could only be assured for a few hours, so they must act, and they must act now. The brother of Catherine's paramour is dispatched to Peterhof, the palace outside of St. Petersburg where Catherine's staying. He dashes out and pulls aside the first carriage he can find. Money makes the driver push the horses hard through the night. Meanwhile, Peter is asleep at Oranienbaum, a small post outside of Petersburg where he's staying to observe one of his regiments before his Danish adventure. The brother of Catherine's lover arrives just as Catherine is waking at 5 a.m. The time has come, he says. He quickly relays the nights in his wake. The brother of Catherine's lover arrives just as Catherine is waking at 5 a.m. The time has come, he says. He quickly relays the night's event. Skipping all the elaborate dress of a high lady of the time, Catherine immediately rushes to the carriage. The horses are exhausted from the travel of the previous night, but as they are crawling down the road toward the capital, a farm wagon on its way to morning market passes. They stop it, and the Empress Consort pushes money into the farmer's hand. She has his 2 great farm horses tethered to her carriage right then and there, and they speed towards St. Petersburg. Out in the drill yard, Peter is making his small contingent of Holstein soldiers parade before him. A messenger brings news of the arrest of the guards and the possible conspiracy. Peter shrugs it off. One by one, Catherine goes to the barracks of each of the guard units stationed in Petersburg. One by one, the regiments swear fealty to her in a jubilous tumult.
We got you, girl.
Meanwhile, Peter is playing violin in his room. A man rushes in to tell him he has a message about happenings in the capital. Annoyed at the interruption, Peter tells the man to put it on the table. He'll read it later. He never does.
I'm almost like not even mad. Like, this guy just doesn't even care at all. It's not like he's even incompetent. He just doesn't care. Like, he never cared. And I don't know the intricacies of kicking King out of office at the time, or out of office, off the throne at the time. But man, you should, like, I'm almost more upset at the people who continue to think he's going to take anything seriously.
Tells the man to put it on the table. He'll read it later. He never does. Surrounded by guards, a procession with Catherine at its center makes its way to the Cathedral of Our Lady Kazan, where the Archbishop of Novgorod pronounces her sovereign autocrat of Russia. Meanwhile, Peter orders a caravan of carriages assembled to take him and his guest back to Peterhof to have a feast. He forgets to order the usual cavalry escort. Catherine and an ever-growing...
What is this? So is this a parody of 24, the show? I never watched it, but I think it has the same preface, like 6 hours remain.
Usual cavalry escort. Catherine and an ever-growing mob process to the Winter Palace. There she meets with assembled members of the Senate and the Holy Synod, the highest religious council of Russia. She declares that out of love for Russia and the Orthodox faith, she had been moved to such action, that, at the urging of her subjects, against an emperor who imperiled them, she took the throne to deliver Russia from foreign powers and foreign religion. Which, I mean, bold move, considering she herself was a foreigner who had come to Russia with a foreign religion, but hey, nobody was really sweating the details at the time. Meanwhile, Peter's group of revelers arrive at Peterhof, only to find no one there. Peter is furious. He storms through the house looking for Catherine. She spoiled his party. To one of his entourage, he screams in rage at her unthinking discourtesy. Didn't I always tell you she was capable of anything? A few of the more senior members of the party offer to head to St. Petersburg to see if they can find her. They had probably put 2 and 2 together by this point. The embassy from Peter's company arrives. One of them begs Catherine not to take up arms against her husband. She takes him by the elbow and leads him to a balcony. Gesturing to the ecstatic crowd, she says, "Deliver your message to them." The small group of messengers all swear fealty to Catherine, or ask to be allowed to retire. Meanwhile, Peter has gotten his first concrete news of all the goings-on from the crew of a firework barge that was sailing to Peterhof to provide the fireworks for his party. But all their information is still vague because they had left early in the morning, as they'd been ordered to go deliver the fireworks. Peter, enraged, orders word to be sent to Oranienbaum to get his Holstein regiment. He shouts that he will defend himself to the death. His men arrive and are posted along the road to the capital, but no one thought to tell them that there might be a fight, so they only brought their wooden parade ground rifles. A Russian uniform is found for Peter, because he was still wearing the
So can they not even fire?
German one that he liked so much. A Russian uniform is found for Peter, because he was still wearing the German one that he liked so much. His advisors gather around him. One counsels that he don the uniform, ride at full haste to the capital, and remind the people who they had sworn an oath to.
If he denies it and keeps the Prussian, man.
Another recommends that he meet up with a larger contingent of the army 70 miles away, and then march on St. Petersburg. A third recommends he flee to Germany. He does nothing. Men are sent to secure a nearby island fortress.
This man doesn't...
Fortress is still loyal. At least this was good news. Catherine had gotten the backing of the Synod, the people, the army, and the Senate without firing a shot. But there was one last thing she had to do.
Synod?
Peter had to formally abdicate. As was the right of the sovereign, she had taken on the rank of the colonel of the Preobrazhensky Guards. Borrowing pieces of a uniform from any of the men who seemed about her size, she strode out to meet her soldiers in the brilliant...
Genius. She's so smart, and Peter is so either dumb or just ambivalent.
Green of the Guards.
Or both.
She would lead the final foray to capture Peter herself. As the march began, a young subaltern rushed up to give her his sword knot, the one piece her uniform yet lacked. This subaltern's name, by the way, was Gregory Potemkin. Peter, meanwhile, chose to withdraw to the island fortress he had secured earlier in the evening. As his boat approached, the harbor was closed off to him. He shouted to the men in the fort, "Do you not know me? I'm your emperor!" To which the reply came, "We no longer have an emperor. Long live Empress Catherine."
How did they get word so fast?
II. In the time between him sending his man to secure the fort and him choosing to finally go there, the top admiral of the Navy had sworn allegiance to the new empress and headed to the fort to take over its command personally. Peter fled into his cabin to hide. When he returned to Peterhof, he dismissed everyone and then went to his room, refusing to speak to his staff. Then he composed a letter to Catherine, apologizing for his bad behavior and offering to share the throne with her. At first light, Catherine receives Peter's letter. She is unimpressed. A few hours later, she receives another letter offering to abdicate if he could just go back to Holstein. She accepts. He writes an abject abdication statement detailing how unfit he is to rule. Needless to say, a few weeks later, he wound up dead in a drunken brawl that was probably a cleverly disguised assassination. And his idol, the man he kept telling himself he was equal to, Frederick the Great? Of the affair, Frederick merely said, he allowed himself to be dethroned like a child being sent to bed. And while Catherine probably had nothing to do with Peter being killed, she did pardon his killers, as his death freed her up to rule without the worry that someone would try and form a counter-rebellion around him. And rule she did, rapidly reversing almost all of Peter's policies. As Russian forces were literally...
Again, guys, like, I don't see it showing up on registered audio input capture, but there's a ton of hammering and sawing and stuff that's pretty loud. So if you do hear it, that's what it is. But yeah, gotta deal with it.
On the verge of engaging with Denmark, Peter's policies. As Russian forces were literally on the verge of engaging with Denmark, rioters arrived with Catherine's orders to return home. In fact, that was the order to all the Russian troops in Europe. She was going to begin an era of neutrality, where Russian troops fought on neither side of the 7 Years' War, and for this, the army was forever grateful. The church, on the other hand, was more complex. She put a temporary moratorium on Peter's order to secularize all church land, but Catherine was intent on being an informed ruler, and as reports came into her every day, one thing became more and more clear. Russia was broke. Grain prices were soaring, the treasury was filled with IOUs. Ending all the wars would help, but not seeing the reparations which might have been expected with a decisive victory, Russia was penniless, and without any recourse to credit. And easily a tenth of all the wealth of Russia was locked up in church lands, wealth that her government needed. After a long back and forth with the Senate about the morality of a church which owned so much property but didn't help with the temporal affairs like charity and education, and with a few threats thrown in, Catherine was able to cow them. All church property became state property. More than 1 million church serfs became peasants, which meant they now had to pay taxes, and all church officials became employees of the state. And this shows the strength of Catherine. Where Peter lost one of the great pillars of the Russian state, and arguably his throne, for his policy, Catherine's iron will and careful management of the other elements of power allowed her to drag in this vast source of government revenue.
She's amazing, and I love her so far, very much so. But we do have to recognize that she is obviously, the alternative to her is an extremely incompetent person like Peter. So I'm not trying to take away from her excellence so far, but it was helped out a lot by the fact that the alternative to her was a lazy or ambivalent idiot.
But in doing so, it also brought up the other great issue for Catherine: serfs. Because serfs in Russia were slaves. They could be bought and sold, abused with no rights over their own bodies. They could be gambled away or traded. They had no choice but to work the vocation their master chose for them, and they couldn't move or leave the land that they were bound to. And with burgeoning industrial revolution, there came to be a new kind of serf. A serf not owned by a master, but owned by a corporation.
So what's the difference between a serf and a slave? Serf versus slave. Serfdom was, after slavery, the most common kind of forced labor. Okay, so slaves are considered forms of property owned by other people. Serfs are bound to the land they occupy from one generation to another. But is there really a difference in the end? Because from what I just saw, okay, so serfs aren't owned by an individual person, but they're pretty much owned by a property. They aren't property, they're owned by and just like we saw, you can do anything to them. You can sell them, auction them off, gamble them away, and so I don't see much of a difference.
Many of whom were employed by the great mining enterprises of the Urals. And in these mines, life was ugly, brutish, and short. Because they were chattel, men were...
It's not funny, but...
Mines, life was ugly, brutish, and short.
I'm 12.
Because they were chattel, men were literally worked to death, beaten when they paused for a moment in their labor. This treatment caused riots and strikes that would eventually lead to the largest peasant revolt in Russian history. So join us next time for the plight of the serfs.
Yes.
With the war in Europe settled and the church finally under her control, Catherine could at last focus on her great project, the law. In her spare time, while not getting distracted by things like getting an ex-lover elected the puppet king of Poland, or corresponding with Voltaire, Catherine focused on lover elected the puppet king of Poland, or corresponding...
Voltaire? Get it, girl. You got this. Same to you. Did it say Voltaire?
With Voltaire, things like Catherine focused on an ex-lover elected the puppet king of Poland, or corresponding with Voltaire, Catherine...
I want to learn about Voltaire. Because I think he has a lot to do with a lot of American revolutionary ideas, I think. Wow, he lived pretty long. Or he lived to 84. Still pretty long, especially for then. Okay.
Focused on lover elected the puppet king of Poland, or corresponding with Voltaire, Catherine focused on writing the Nakaz, a massive set of guidelines for how to rewrite the laws of the land. These weren't laws, mind you, but rather guidelines on how to make laws, because Catherine had a novel idea. She would bring together representatives of her people and ask them what problems they faced that needed fixing before she actually went about making new laws. And so she assembled representatives from every free class, region, and religion in her empire to come together and discuss what laws needed to be made. And in some ways, this was incredibly
sort of like a republic?
Inclusive. She had representatives who were Cossacks, representatives who were Muslims, even representatives who were Buddhists. But there was one group that was left out. That whole free part in free class meant that there would be no serfs. After all, the serfs' owners could look after their interests, right? But no serfs meant that 9/10 of the empire went unrepresented. And as for the representatives of the 1/10 who did show up for her great assembly on laws, they were utterly unprepared for it. There really hadn't been much involvement in government in Russia up to this point, and truth be...
It's like, okay, what do you guys need? That was loud. What do you guys need? Well, what's needed in your territory? I have no idea.
Told, many of the people involved held at least some suspicion that this was a trick or some sort of loyalty test. For the first of many meetings, they debated what honorific to award Catherine.
Great.
If you are wondering, the Great just narrowly beat out All-Wise Mother of the Fatherland. Catherine found this infuriating.
Why? I thought that Russia referred to the motherland. I thought it was more Germany.
Did they not understand that she had called them here to help her figure out what laws to make, not to just give her titles? Well, no. In fact, a fair number of them couldn't even read the guidelines she gave them, and even fewer really understood the heavy Enlightenment philosophy which formed the basis of the Nakaz, which meant that getting anything useful from them was like pulling teeth. The merchants wanted the rights of nobles. The nobles wanted to be able to engage in commerce as merchants, and the peasants mostly gave very specific complaints about how that jerk Boris from the next village over keeps letting his cows trample my fence.
Wait, so a peasant can own serfs?
Can we make a law about that? Catherine was an autocrat at heart. She believed in absolutism, but she wanted data. She felt that an autocrat should rule with knowledge and understanding, but knowledge and understanding were in short supply in these meetings. Finally, after much frustration, the whole affair was called off. Foreign events had become more pressing. Remember when I mentioned that Catherine had put a puppet on the Polish throne? Well, she'd been having that puppet do things that were more and more clearly against the best interest of the Poles. The Polish people finally rebelled, and the Russian army was sent in to put the rebellion down. But in doing so, a Russian regiment chased fleeing Polish insurgents into Ottoman territory.
Just like with Charles XII, or the Swedes.
A Russian regiment chased fleeing Polish insurgents into Ottoman territory. The French had been leaning on the Ottomans to get into the Polish conflict for some time, and this seemed like just the excuse. So the Ottomans locked up the Russian ambassador and went to war. This turned out to be a...
When it comes to the World War I, the Ottomans seem so incredibly weak, but it seems like around this time they're not exactly a pushover empire when whoever runs into the Ottoman Empire, the Russians aren't brave enough to go in there.
The Ottomans locked up the Russian ambassador and went to war. This turned out to be a poor decision on the Ottomans' part. Once seen as near equals, the Russians belied expectations and delivered the Ottomans a series of crushing defeats.
Maybe not.
On land, the Russian forces, led in small part by one Grigory Potemkin, seemed invincible. And at sea, where the Turks thought themselves to be unopposed because the Russians had no port on the Black Sea, the Russians conceived of a bold plan to take the Baltic fleet, sail it all the way around Europe, and surprise the Ottoman fleet from the rear. The plan worked. The Ottoman navy...
So they didn't see any Japanese submarines? Does anyone get that reference?
Navy suffered massive losses at little cost to the Russians. But the Russians didn't get quite as much from the war as might first have been supposed, partly because of pressure from other foreign entities.
Let me know in the comments if anyone just got what I said. It was a joke, but it involves
who didn't want to upset the balance of power been supposed to the Russians. But the Russians didn't get quite as much from the war as might first have been supposed, partly because of pressure from other foreign entities who didn't want to upset the balance of power too greatly, and partly because something curious was happening back home in the Urals. But first we must talk of the treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Kachuk-Kainarza. It gave the Russians a fair swath of territory, but most importantly, it gave Russia ports on the Black Sea,
Crimea,
which had been one of their strategic goals for a very long time. It also provided war reparations, which helped with the ongoing problem of Russia being kinda broke. Lastly, it made Russia the protector of Orthodox Christians living in the Ottoman Empire, something that will absolutely...
It will come back in 1852 or 1851, Crimean War.
Come up if we ever cover the Crimean War. Alright, so, with the war against the Ottoman, the protector of Orthodox Christians living in the Ottoman Empire. Something that will absolutely come up if we ever cover the Crimean War. Alright, so, with the war against the Ottomans thus concluded, Catherine could turn to another niggling issue, the fact that half of her country was up in arms. At first it seemed like a small revolt, a little nothing out in the boonies. But then, when Catherine sent a force to pacify it, that force was defeated. So she sent another
It reminds me of the bunny scene in Monty Python. Holy Grail.
force out to pacify it, and the commander lost his head. Literally. This was getting to be a problem. In fact, it was a huge problem, one that would require the help of some of those troops that had been tied up fighting the Ottomans to solve. Because what had started out as a small group of discontented Cossacks had grown into the largest peasant rebellion Russia had ever seen. The horrible conditions of serfdom, the increase in tax collectors and government officials messing with Cossack affairs, and discontent of the old believers with the Orthodox hierarchy meant that these groups had become dry tinder just waiting for a lit match. And a man named Pugachev had fanned that discontent into a firestorm. Pugachev claimed that he was Peter III, that he had escaped the attempt on his life, and that his wife and the evil nobles had deposed him because he was about to sign into law a decree freeing all the serfs. He was also offering freedom of religion and a tax-free return to the traditional way of life for the Cossacks. To a lot of people, that sounded like a pretty good deal, and for a year, they
Sounded like an insane plan, but it worked, I guess.
They held sway over vast parts of Russia, often dealing savagely with any nobles unlucky enough to cross their path. But at last, as the troops began to pour back from Ottoman lands, Catherine sent out an overwhelming force to snuff out the rebellion. But even as this fire was being put out, a much worse specter flared up. Smallpox. Smallpox was still the bane of Europe. No one was safe from it, noble or commoner, king or priest. It had just burnt through the Austrian royal family, destroying their line of succession. And here Catherine was, never having contracted it. Perhaps worse still, here her son was, with whispers all around court of the uncertainty of his ever ascending the throne, because he had not yet suffered and survived the disease. Catherine herself said that she lived in fear of the disease every day.
So they knew, not that they knew the reason that, like, their immune system developed antibodies or something, or an immune response to the smallpox. But they seemed to know that once you got smallpox and survived, you were very unlikely to get it again. And so that they knew that already is kind of cool.
Survived the disease. Catherine herself said that she lived in fear of the disease every day. Too many people she had known had been claimed by it. So at last, student of the Enlightenment that she was, she took a bold step. She summoned a doctor from Britain to inoculate her.
Wow,
this science
they knew this?
Was fairly new at the time, and though the doctor she brought in was one of the experts in the field, everyone thought her mad. Many were convinced that she would die. But she lived. After a few small pustules and some aches, she was fit and forever inured against the disease. Soon she had her son inoculated too. But she didn't just do this for herself. She knew that her people were a wary, suspicious people, especially when it came to disease. She hoped that, by her example, she could convince others to get inoculated too. And it worked. Soon, much of the court followed her example. In fact, she had inoculation stations set up in most of the provinces, and a large...
That's pretty cool. I had no idea that this inoculation was known in the 1700s.
...number of Russians benefited from this, one of the true wonders of modern medicine. There would be other plagues during her tenure as Empress, some unthinkably terrible, but this one great lingering fear, this one tragedy that once fell on almost every house, this she was able to do something about. By the end of her reign, nearly 2 million Russians would be inoculated. But with the home front quiet, and her efforts on medicine and childcare taking root, it was time again to look beyond the borders of Russia.
Something I don't understand about, like, the inoculation back then, obviously they didn't have like perfectly tested and formed vaccines, is that what did they introduce? Like, wouldn't that just give her smallpox? I mean, clearly it didn't, but it's just amazing that what they... Oh, scabs?
Russia, or perhaps more accurately, to the borders of Russia, and how they might be expanded on medicine and childcare taking root, it was time again to look beyond the borders of Russia, or perhaps more accurately, to the borders of Russia, and how they might be expanded. Join us next time for changing alliances, sprawling wars, and the partition of Poland.
All right, guys, that's another 2. And yeah, really cool. I will get to parts 5 and 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so 5 and 6 are really the last 2 episodes. So I will do them next time. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you learned something or can teach me something in the comments. Love to have you join the Discord. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.